When the temperature hits 104 degrees, people stop going outside. The streets empty out, the windows are locked shut, and the deafening hum of window air conditioning units drowns out every other sound in the neighborhood. You think you're safe inside your climate-controlled fortress until you realize the AC is masking the sound of someone breaking in. I was 20 years old, home from college for the summer. It was the middle of July in a sprawling, densely wooded suburb of Atlanta, Georgia. We were in the middle of a brutal, record-breaking heat wave. My parents had left for a week-long vacation to the coast, leaving me alone to house-sit and look after our elderly golden retriever, Buster. Our house was situated at the end of a long cul-de-sac, backed entirely by thick, untamed pine forest. Because of the heat, the cicadas were deafening. It was a constant, pulsating, high-pitched mechanical whine that vibrated through the glass of the windows. It was a Wednesday night, around 11:30 p.m. I was lying on the couch in the living room watching TV with the central air blasting. Buster was asleep on the cool hardwood floor near the front door. Suddenly, the TV flickered and died. The hum of the AC unit sputtered and cut out. The digital clock on the microwave went dark. The power to the entire street had just blown. Within 10 minutes, the house became a sauna. The oppressive, suffocating humidity of the Georgia summer seeped through the walls. I grabbed a heavy Maglite flashlight from the kitchen drawer and walked around the house, opening a few windows on the first floor just to get a cross breeze going. The screens were locked in place, so I wasn't worried about bugs or animals getting in. With the windows open, the sound of the cicadas in the backyard was overwhelmingly loud. It sounded like thousands of tiny buzzsaws screaming in the dark. I went back to the living room, stripped down to a t-shirt and shorts, and lay on the couch, sweating, trying to fall asleep. Around 1 a.m., Buster stood up. He didn't bark. He just stood up very slowly, the fur on his spine standing straight up, and let out a low, continuous growl, staring directly down the dark hallway toward the kitchen at the back of the house. I sat up, my heart rate instantly spiking. Buster was a gentle dog. He never growled. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, aiming my heavy flashlight down the hall, but keeping it turned off so I wouldn't blind myself or give away my position. The kitchen was pitch black, illuminated only faintly by the moonlight shining through the large open window above the sink. I slowly stood up, my bare feet completely silent on the hardwood floor. I gripped the heavy metal flashlight like a club and crept down the hallway, pressing my back against the wall. As I got closer to the kitchen, I noticed the sound of the cicadas was different. The deafening wall of noise coming from the backyard was being interrupted. Something was moving through the heavy brush right outside the kitchen window, crushing dry leaves and snapping twigs, causing the insects in that specific area to momentarily stop buzzing. I peered around the corner of the hallway into the kitchen. Standing right outside the open window, illuminated by the pale moonlight, was the silhouette of a man. He was incredibly tall, wearing a heavy, dark winter parka with the hood pulled up, which was absolute insanity given it was nearly 90 degrees outside in the middle of the night. He was standing perfectly still, his face pressed directly against the wire mesh of the window screen, staring into my dark kitchen. A wave of primal, freezing terror washed over me. I couldn't breathe. I was completely paralyzed. Then he raised his hand. In his fist, he was holding a box cutter. I watched in absolute horror as he pressed the razor-sharp blade against the top corner of the window screen and slowly, deliberately began to slice downward. Rap. The sound of the thick mesh tearing was sickeningly loud. I didn't yell. I knew if I yelled, he would know exactly where I was. I slowly backed away, retreating down the hallway toward the living room. I grabbed Buster by the collar, pulling him frantically toward the front door. I intended to unlock it, run out into the street, and scream for the neighbors. But as my trembling hand reached for the deadbolt on the front door, I heard a heavy, wet thud from the kitchen. He was inside. The layout of the house meant the kitchen led directly into the living room. I was trapped. If I turned the deadbolt, the loud mechanical click would echo through the silent house, and he would be on me in seconds. I pulled Buster away from the door and scrambled silently toward the downstairs bathroom, a small windowless room tucked under the staircase. I pulled the dog inside, closed the wooden door until it just barely clicked shut, and locked it. I sat in the pitch-black bathtub, holding Buster's snout shut with both hands so he wouldn't bark, tears streaming down my face. I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket. No service. The power outage must have knocked out the local cell tower. I was entirely cut off. I sat in the suffocating heat of the dark bathroom, straining to listen over the sound of my own erratic heartbeat and the droning cicadas outside. Creak. A floorboard groaned under heavy weight. He was walking through the house. The footsteps were slow, methodical, and heavy. He wasn't rushing. He was taking his time, searching room by room. I heard him open the coat closet. I heard him walk into my father's study. Then the footsteps stopped right outside the bathroom door. I squeezed my eyes shut, holding my breath until my lungs burned. Buster was trembling violently in my arms. Click. The handle of the bathroom door slowly turned. The heavy metal mechanism hit the locked deadbolt and stopped. For 10 agonizing seconds, there was absolute silence on the other side of the door. I could hear him breathing, a heavy, wet, ragged sound. Then a voice whispered through the thin wooden door. It was a man's voice, raspy and completely devoid of emotion. "I know you're in there. It's too hot to hide in a closet. Open the door." I didn't make a sound. I bit down on my lips so hard I tasted copper. He violently grabbed the doorknob and began rattling it with terrifying force. The door shook in its frame, the wood splintering slightly around the lock. He threw his shoulder against the door. Bang! I raised my heavy flashlight, preparing to swing it at his skull the second the wood gave way. Bang! Suddenly, the blinding glare of the living room lights flicked on, shining through the crack under the bathroom door. The deafening roar of the central air conditioning unit kicked on instantly. The TV in the living room blared to life at high volume. The power had come back on. The man stopped hitting the door. I heard him curse loudly, his heavy boots pounding furiously against the hardwood floor as he sprinted back toward the kitchen. I heard him scramble frantically out the broken window. I stayed in that bathtub for another 3 hours until the sun finally came up. When I called the police, they found the screen sliced completely open and wet, muddy boot prints leading from the kitchen to the bathroom door. But the most terrifying detail they found was in the backyard. Behind the heavy brush near the kitchen window, they found an area where the grass was completely flattened. Surrounding it were dozens of empty water bottles and food wrappers. He hadn't just targeted the house randomly during the power outage. He had been camping in the sweltering heat of the woods just feet from our back door for days, waiting for the perfect opportunity to cut the screen, listening to the cicadas and watching me through the glass. There's an unspoken rule among the locals in my rural Pennsylvania hometown. You never swim in the flooded limestone quarry after dark. We tell the tourists it's because of the jagged rocks or the rusting, submerged mining machinery trapped 50 feet below the surface. But the locals know the real reason. You don't swim at night because of what floats to the surface when the sun goes down. It was mid-August, the summer before my senior year of high school. The humidity was oppressive, hanging in the air like a wet blanket even long after midnight. I was hanging out with two of my closest friends, Mark and Sarah. We were incredibly bored, sweating in the back of Mark's pickup truck, when Sarah suggested we drive out to the old quarry to cool off. We knew the stories, but we were 17 and arrogant. We figured it was just an urban legend designed to keep teenagers from trespassing. We drove down a heavily overgrown, unpaved logging road for about 3 miles before parking the truck. We grabbed our towels and flashlights and hiked the remaining half-mile through the dense, pitch-black woods. The quarry was massive. It was a perfect, deep, circular crater surrounded by sheer, 50-foot-high limestone cliffs on 3 sides. On the 4th side, the ground sloped gently down into the water, creating a small sandy beach area. Floating directly in the center of the lake was an old, rotting wooden raft, anchored to the bottom by chains. The water was completely black. It reflected the moonlight perfectly, like a massive pane of obsidian glass. "I'm not going in," Sarah said, hugging her towel around her shoulders. "It's way too creepy. I'll just sit on the tailgate and play music." Mark laughed, calling her a coward. We stripped down to our swim trunks. Mark took a running start from the beach and dove headfirst into the pitch-black water. He surfaced a few seconds later, gasping. "It's freezing!" he yelled, his voice echoing loudly off the sheer limestone cliffs. "But it feels amazing. Come on." I waded into the water. The drop-off was immediate. After 3 steps, the ground vanished beneath my feet, and I was treading in water that was easily 60 feet deep. The cold was shocking, instantly numbing my legs. "Race you to the raft," Mark yelled, immediately swimming out toward the center of the dark lake. I followed him, the cold water splashing in my face. The swim felt much longer than it looked from the shore. By the time we reached the rotting wooden raft, we were both out of breath. We pulled ourselves up onto the slippery wood, our legs dangling in the freezing water. We sat there for about 20 minutes, looking up at the stars, listening to the faint sound of Sarah's music drifting across the water from the beach. Then the music abruptly cut off. "Sarah!" Mark yelled out toward the dark shoreline. No response. The echo faded, leaving a heavy, oppressive silence. "Her prone probably died," I said, though a knot of unease started to form in my stomach. I looked down at the pitch-black water swirling around my dangling legs. I couldn't see an inch below the surface. Suddenly, something brushed against my left calf. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't a piece of driftwood. It felt like a cold, wet, leathery hand wrapping around my ankle for a fraction of a second before slipping away.
I recoiled violently, pulling my knees to my chest. "Dude, something just grabbed my leg," I said, my voice shaking. Mark rolled his eyes. "It's just seaweed, man. Stop being paranoid." "There is no seaweed in a limestone quarry," I snapped, standing up on the unsteady raft. I peered into the dark water, looking for any sign of movement. I looked toward the shoreline, squinting into the gloom. Standing waist-deep in the water near the beach was a figure. "Hey, Sarah's coming in," Mark said, pointing. I looked closer. The figure was standing perfectly still, facing us, but the proportions were entirely wrong. It was far too tall to be Sarah. The shoulders were incredibly broad, and arms hung down to the surface of the water at an unnatural length. That's not Sarah," I whispered. "Hey!" Mark yelled across the water. "Who is that?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it slowly, deliberately took a step forward into the deeper water, then another. The water rose to its chest, then its neck, until it completely submerged beneath the black surface without making a single ripple. Panic seized my chest. Someone or something was in the water with us, and it was swimming directly toward the raft. "We need to go," I said, my voice completely frantic. "Now!" "Are you crazy? It's between us and the shore," Mark yelled, clearly terrified now. "I don't care. I'm not staying on this piece of wood in the middle of a 60-foot drop." Before Mark could argue, the heavy iron chain that anchored the raft to the bottom of the quarry violently jerked. The entire wooden platform lurched downward, nearly throwing us into the water. Something massive was climbing the chain from the bottom. Clink, clink. The heavy iron links groaned under immense weight. I didn't think. I dove off the back of the raft, swimming in the opposite direction of the beach, heading straight for the sheer, jagged limestone cliffs. It was the longest, most terrifying swim of my life. Every time my hand broke the water, I expected to feel those long, leathery fingers wrap around my ankle and drag me down into the abyss. I heard Mark splash into the water behind me, frantically swimming in my wake. We reached the base of the cliffs. The rock was sharp and covered in slime, but pure adrenaline allowed us to haul ourselves completely out of the water, clinging to a narrow, jagged ledge about 5 feet above the surface. We turned and looked back at the raft. Illuminated by the moonlight, a pale, swollen figure was hauling itself onto the wooden platform. It looked vaguely human, but its skin was bloated and completely gray. Its hair was stringy and clung to a skull that looked crushed on one side. It crouched on the raft on all fours, turning its head with slow, jerky movements, scanning the surface of the water. Then it let out a sound that I will never unhear. It wasn't a roar. It was a wet, gurgling sob, like a drowning man trying to call for help with lungs completely filled with water. It dove back off the raft, splashing violently into the dark water, swimming rapidly toward the beach. We clung to that sheer rock wall for 4 hours. We were freezing, bleeding from the jagged limestone, completely terrified to make a sound. When the sun finally began to rise, turning the black water to a deep, murky green, the quarry was completely empty. We swam back to the beach, sprinting through the woods to Mark's truck. Sarah was locked inside the cab, fast asleep. We woke her up, hysterical, screaming at her to drive. She said she had gotten creeped out by the silence of the woods and decided to wait in the locked truck. She had no idea what we were talking about. We went to the police. They dragged the quarry a week later. They didn't find the creature we described, but directly beneath the wooden raft, entangled in the rusted iron anchor chains, 60 feet down, they found the bloated, decaying remains of a man who had been reported missing a decade ago. I've never swam in open water since that night, because you know that when you're treading water in the dark, your feet are dangling in an entirely different world, and you are at the mercy of whatever is looking up at you from the bottom.
Driving with your windows down on a warm summer night feels like the ultimate expression of freedom. You control the speed, the destination, and the music. But when you are 50 miles from the nearest town, driving down a corridor of dense black trees, and the only other car on the road turns its headlights off to follow you in the dark, that freedom instantly turns into a cage. I was 21, a junior in college, making the massive cross-country drive from my parents' home in Texas back to my university in Colorado. It was late August, the final days of summer. I was driving my old, reliable Honda Civic, loaded down with all my earthly possessions. I heavily preferred driving at night to avoid the brutal daytime heat and the heavy interstate traffic. By 2 a.m., I was somewhere in northern New Mexico, driving down Highway 45, a desolate 2-lane blacktop that cut straight through miles of completely unpopulated high desert scrub and dense pine forests. I had been driving for 5 hours straight. My eyes were burning, and I desperately needed to use a restroom and stretch my legs. My GPS indicated there were absolutely no gas stations for another 60 miles, but about 10 miles ahead there was a state-run roadside rest area. I pulled off the highway. The rest area was a small, circular parking lot surrounded by incredibly tall, imposing pine trees. The only building was a small cinder-block restroom facility illuminated by a single, flickering, harsh, yellow sodium light. There were no other cars in the lot. It was completely deserted. I parked under the light, leaving the engine running and my headlights on just to provide extra visibility. I grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from my glove compartment, locked the doors behind me, and walked toward the men's room. The air was thick and humid, the silence of the forest broken only by the loud, rhythmic chirping of crickets. I walked into the restroom. It was filthy, smelling heavily of bleach and old urine. I used the urinal quickly, washed my hands, and hurried back out into the humid night air. As I stepped out of the cinder-block building, I stopped dead in my tracks. Parked directly next to my Civic, completely blocking my driver's side door, was a massive, heavily rusted, lifted pickup truck. The engine was off. The headlights were off. I hadn't heard it pull in. I stood in the shadows of the restroom overhang, my heart rate instantly skyrocketing. The windows of the truck were heavily tinted. I couldn't see if anyone was inside. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound confident. No response. The crickets continued to scream in the trees. I gripped my heavy metal flashlight tightly. I didn't want to walk up to my car while that truck was parked so aggressively close. I waited in the shadows for a full 5 minutes, staring at the rusted metal. Finally, I decided I couldn't stay at the rest stop all night. I walked a wide circle around the back of the truck, intending to enter my car through the passenger side and climb over the center console. As I rounded the tailgate of the truck, I saw him. Standing on the opposite side of my Civic, obscured from my view until that moment, was a man. He was incredibly tall, wearing a filthy, grease-stained mechanic's jumpsuit. He wasn't looking at me. He was leaning over the hood of my running car, holding a pair of heavy bolt cutters, attempting to wedge them under the crack of my hood to cut the battery cable. "Hey!" I screamed, the pure adrenaline completely erasing my fear. The man snapped his head up. His face was covered in a thick, bushy beard, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. He dropped the bolt cutters, reached into the deep pocket of his jumpsuit, and pulled out a massive, heavy tire iron. He didn't say a word. He just started sprinting around the front of my car, directly toward me. I didn't try to fight. I lunged for the passenger side door of my Civic, grabbed the handle, threw the door open, and hurled myself inside. I slammed the door shut and hit the automatic locks just as the man lunged into the side of my car, swinging the heavy metal tire iron with terrifying force.
Crack. The tire iron smashed into my passenger window. The safety glass spiderwebbed completely, but held together. I screamed, scrambled over the center console into the driver's seat, threw the car into reverse, and slammed on the gas. My tires squealed on the asphalt as I backed rapidly out of the parking space, nearly hitting a tree. I slammed it into drive and floored it out of the rest area, hitting the dark asphalt of Highway 45 at 60 miles an hour. I looked in my rearview mirror, my chest heaving with panic. The rusted pickup truck was pulling out of the rest area. The driver turned his headlights on. They were blindingly bright, customized high beams. He was coming right for me. I pushed the gas pedal to the floor. My old Civic groaned, hitting 80, then 90 miles an hour. The steering wheel shook violently. The truck was faster. It gained on me rapidly, the blinding headlights filling my entire rearview mirror, completely destroying my night vision. He rode my bumper, mere inches away, at 90 miles an hour. If I tapped my brakes, I would die. Then he did something incredibly terrifying. He completely turned off his headlights. At 90 miles an hour, in the pitch black of the forest highway, the massive truck completely vanished from my mirrors. I was driving blind, my own headlights cutting through the darkness ahead, but I had absolutely no idea where the massive machine stalking me was. I couldn't hear his engine over the roar of my own car. I gripped the steering wheel, completely paralyzed by fear, staring at the black mirrors. Bam! A massive force slammed into the rear quarter panel of my car. My car violently fishtailed. I screamed, wrestling the steering wheel desperately to regain control before I spun out into the dense trees. He hadn't stopped. He was driving completely blacked out, deliberately trying to pit maneuver me off the highway into the ditch. I regained control, pushing the car to 95. I grabbed my cell phone from the passenger seat and dialed 911 on speakerphone. "I'm on Highway 45. Someone is trying to run me off the road. Please, he's trying to kill me," I screamed to the dispatcher. "Sir, calm down. What is your nearest cross street or mile marker?" the dispatcher replied frantically. "I don't know. It's pitch black. I just passed the state rest area 10 miles ago." "I have officers en route from the next county line. Do not stop your vehicle. Keep driving." Bam! He hit me again, this time on the driver's side rear panel. I swerved into the oncoming lane, completely losing traction for a terrifying second before the tires caught the asphalt again. He was playing with me. He was a hunter, using the darkness as camouflage, trying to terrify me into making a fatal mistake. For the next 20 agonizing minutes, I drove at a terrifying speed through the twisting mountain highway, completely terrified of the black void behind me. He would occasionally turn his high beams on for a split second, blinding me, just to let me know he was still right on my bumper before shutting them off again. Finally, I saw the glowing lights of a massive truck stop glowing in the distance, a beacon of civilization. As I approached the brightly lit exit ramp, I looked in my mirror. The rusted truck had stopped pursuing. I saw the faint red glow of his taillights as he pulled an illegal U-turn in the middle of the dark highway, disappearing back into the pitch-black forest. I pulled into the truck stop, surrounded by 18-wheelers and harsh fluorescent lights, put the car in park, and completely broke down sobbing. The state troopers arrived a few minutes later. They took a report, looking at the massive dents and chipped paint on the rear of my car. They set up a patrol on Highway 45, but they never found the rusted truck. The officer who took my statement told me something that haunts me every time I get behind the wheel. He told me that the stretch of highway I was on was notorious. They had found 3 abandoned cars on that route over the past 5 years. The cars had been forced off the road, but the drivers were entirely missing. I never drive at night anymore. The summer heat during the day might be brutal, but it's nothing compared to the absolute suffocating terror of realizing that in the dark, you are completely at the mercy of whatever decides to hunt you.